He was a man who kept to himself until he found a girl the world had thrown away. What followed was a battle not just for survival, but for the right to belong. The sun was sinking low when Elias Mercer led his horse down to the creek that cut through the far edge of his land, the water running thin but steady after a long dry spell. He had come to water the animal and fill his canteen, nothing more, but what he found waiting there made him pause with his hand tight on the reins. A girl lay half hidden in the tall reeds, her dress torn, her lips cracked from thirst, her dark skin hot with fever even at a distance. Her chest rose and fell in a shallow rhythm that spoke of hours left, maybe less, and when her eyes flickered open, they fixed on him with a kind of stubborn fire that startled him more than the sight of her itself. She was Navajo. That much he could tell from the beads still tied into her braids, and that meant trouble for him if anyone saw her on his land. For a long moment, Elias stood rooted, the weight of choice pressing down harder than the sun on his back. He knew the stories, knew what could happen to a man caught helping one of her kind, knew how quickly whispers could turn into accusations, and how accusations could end with a rope swinging from the nearest tree. His life had been built on staying apart, on avoiding ties that could drag him down, and the smart thing would have been to ride away, to pretend he had never seen her. Yet when he shifted, the girl's gaze clung to him, unyielding, as if daring him to leave. He crouched beside her, the dust of his boots settling around her face. Her breath rattled, shallow and strained, and when he touched her wrist, her pulse fluttered weakly against his calloused fingers. She did not flinch, did not plead, only stared, her eyes dark and steady, like coals refusing to die. Elias cursed under his breath and looked back toward the open prairie, half expecting riders to crest the ridge at any moment. No one came. Only the steady rush of the creek and the creak of his saddle filled the silence. "You're a fool, Mercer," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he meant her for wandering this far, or himself for even thinking what he was about to do. With a grunt, he slipped his arms beneath her slight frame, surprised at how light she was, bones and heat wrapped in torn cloth. She made a small sound, not quite pain, not quite relief, and then went still against his chest. He carried her to his horse, hoisted her across the saddle, and swung up behind, the decision made before he could talk himself out of it. The ride back to the ranch was slow, every shadow along the horizon pulling at his nerves, every bird call sounding sharper than it should. Still, he pressed on, the girl's shallow breaths rising and falling against the leather. By the time he reached his cabin, the sky was a deep red wash, and Elias knew he had crossed a line he could never step back from. He laid her on his cot, dampened a rag, and pressed it to her brow. Her eyes opened once more, just a flicker, and in that flicker he saw something he had not felt in years, something that made his chest tighten. Defiance, yes, but also a will to live, and against all reason Elias Mercer decided he would see that spark fed, not smothered. The nights stretched long and heavy inside Elias Mercer's cabin, the walls holding in the heat of the day and the weight of silence. He had laid the girl on his cot, her thin body restless under the wool blanket, her skin burning with fever that refused to break. Elias was no doctor, only a rancher with calloused hands and a life built on work and solitude. Yet he found himself moving with a care that surprised him, dipping cloths in the basin and pressing them against her brow, trickling small sips of water past her cracked lips, waiting for the faint swallow that meant she was still clinging to life. She did not speak, only opened her eyes now and then, watching him with a look that was neither gratitude nor trust, only a wary awareness that she was not dead yet, and that he was the reason why. He sat by the fire most nights, one eye on her, the other on the slow dance of the flames, his thoughts turning in circles he had long avoided. It would have been easier if she had been just another stray calf, something to nurse back to strength and send out to pasture. But she was no animal, and no child either, though she was young. There was something in the way she held herself, even in sickness, that spoke of pride and pain woven too tightly together. At times when her fever raged, she would twist and mutter in a tongue he could not understand, her hands clutching at the blanket as if fighting off ghosts he could not see. Once she cried out in the dark, a single word that came sharp as a knife, and when he asked her what it meant, she only turned her head away. On the fourth night, when he thought perhaps she would not last until morning, she opened her eyes clear and steady, her lips moving with effort. "Aiyana," she whispered, the sound barely more than breath. Elias leaned closer, certain he had misheard, but she repeated it, her voice frayed yet certain. He realized then it was her name. He said it back to her, clumsy on his tongue, and for the first time her eyes softened, though only for a moment. Then she closed them again and sank into sleep, leaving him with the echo of it in his head. The days blurred, each one measured by the rise and fall of her breathing, by the small tasks he did around the cabin, by the watch he kept for movement on the horizon. More than once he thought he saw shadows where the land rose into ridges, riders maybe, or just the tricks of a tired moth. When he looked back at her, he found her watching him with those guarded eyes, as if she knew what he feared, and carried secrets heavier than fever. She was not simply lost, he could feel it, not the way a child might wander from camp. There was weight in her silence, a story unspoken but sharp enough to cut, and though Elias did not press her, he knew with a certainty as solid as the earth beneath the cabin, that this girl was running from something that would not be left behind so easily. The morning was quiet, the kind of quiet Elias Mercer had come to expect on his spread, broken only by the lowing of cattle and the steady creak of the windmill turning against the breeze. He was mending a stretch of fence near the creek when his eyes caught movement high on the ridge beyond his land. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, the sun lifting against the stone, but then he saw the dark outline of a horse and rider, still as a carving, watching the valley below. Another shifted just behind, their figures sharp against the sky. He stood with one hand on the post, hammer heavy in his grip, and let his gaze linger long enough to be sure. They were Navajo scouts, and they were watching his ranch. He said nothing when he went back to the cabin, though the sight stayed in his mind like a burr that refused to be shaken loose. Inside, the girl was sitting up for the first time, the blanket draped around her shoulders, her face still pale from fever but her eyes alert. She looked stronger than she had days ago, yet there was a guardedness about her, as if each breath she took was borrowed. Elias set the hammer down on the table and poured water into a tin cup. "Saw riders up on the ridge," he said evenly, though his voice carried the weight of meaning. Her head snapped up, and the smallest flinch crossed her face before she hid it. It was quick, that flinch, but not quick enough for him to miss. He watched her fingers tighten on the blanket, her eyes darting to the window and then back to him. She said nothing, her lips pressing into a thin line, but silence can speak louder than words. Elias leaned back in his chair, studying her, and felt the unease coil tighter in his chest. If those riders had come searching for her, if they were her kin, then why did she look more frightened than relieved? "Your people?" he asked at last, his tone neither sharp nor soft, just steady. She lowered her eyes and shook her head once, then again, as if denying not only his question but the thought of it. Her silence was thick, heavy with things she would not say, and he did not press further. Still, he had lived long enough to know the truth hides in what folk choose not to answer. Whatever tie bound her to those riders was not one she welcomed. The day wore on, the ridgeline empty when next he looked, but the unease remained. Elias found himself circling the cattle closer to the homestead, his rifle never far from reach. When night fell, he kept the lantern low and checked the latch on the door twice. The girl lay on the cot, her eyes open in the dim glow, watching the shadows dance against the wall. He wondered if she too had seen the riders, if she knew why they lingered, and if she feared what might follow. When he finally stretched out on the floor near the fire, her voice came soft, so faint he almost thought it was the wind. "They don't want me back," she whispered, and then turned her face into the blanket. Elias lay still, staring at the ceiling beams, his jaw tight. Whatever her story was, it was carved deep and cruel, and it had reached his land now. The shadows on the ridge had not come by accident. The fever had broken, and the girl's strength returned in small measures, not all at once but in steady steps like a stream filling after rain. Elias saw it in the way she carried herself, her back straighter, her movements less clumsy. She began to do little things without him asking, carrying water from the creek in a tin pail that was too big for her hands, grinding corn at the table with slow, patient turns, mending the seams of his worn shirts with clumsy but determined stitches. She moved about the cabin quiet as a shadow, her dark hair falling into her face, her lips pressed tight, as if each word she kept inside cost her nothing but pain. Elias did not stop her from working, though part of him wanted to tell her she owed him nothing, because he knew that work was her way of clinging to a place she did not yet believe was hers. He would sometimes watch her from the porch while she walked the fence line, stooping to collect fallen branches for kindling, her small frame bent against the wind. At other times, he found her crouched by the fire pit outside, turning stones with the end of a stick as though she was searching for something in the dirt. He did not ask questions, not then, because he knew too well the need for silence, when words threatened to cut open wounds that had never healed. She gave her name once, and only once, Aiyana, and though he said it rarely, he carried it in his thoughts the way he carried the memory of his wife, tender but heavy. One evening he sat at the table, oiling his rifle, while Aiyana sat across from him grinding dried corn into meal. The sound of stone against stone filled the cabin, steady and slow, until Elias asked a question he had held back for too long. "Do you have family?" His voice was low, not demanding, but even so her hands froze. The pestle slipped in her grip, and her dark eyes lifted to his with a hardness that was sharp enough to stop him cold. She did not answer, only turned her face away, her jaw set, the weight of her silence saying more than any words could. He knew that look. He had worn it himself, when neighbors spoke of his wife, gone too soon, her grave marked by a wooden cross, out near the cottonwoods. He remembered how he had turned away, the ache too raw to let anyone see. He saw that same ache in Aiyana's eyes now, only deeper, carved younger, a wound that had been given not by death, but by the hands of the living. Elias set the rifle aside and said nothing more. The girl's shoulders loosened as if the air around her had shifted, and she returned to grinding corn, each motion deliberate, as though the act itself was her shield. Elias leaned back in his chair, watching the firelight flicker across the walls, and in that silence he understood enough. She carried a past she could not speak, and it was not for him to drag it out of her. All he could do was give her space to breathe, the same way he wished someone had once done for him. The night had been still, the kind of quiet that makes a man forget danger might be anywhere close. The cattle were bedded down, the horses shifting slow in their stalls, and Elias sat on the porch with his boots propped against the rail, a pipe in his teeth, and the stars stretched endless overhead. Aiyana was inside, curled near the hearth with a blanket, her thin frame finally showing signs of rest instead of fever. For a moment Elias thought maybe the world had granted them peace, a chance to breathe without watching the ridges for riders. Then the sound came sharp and sudden, a solid thud that split the quiet like a hammer on wood. He rose at once, pipe falling to the floor as the second strike landed, another arrow biting deep into the barn door. The horses screamed, rearing against their ropes, hooves pounding against the boards. The cattle lowed in panic, pressing hard against the fencing, dust rising in a frantic cloud. Elias snatched his rifle from the wall, his pulse steady, though his gut turned cold. Aiyana appeared in the doorway, eyes wide, her small hands clutching the frame as if holding herself upright against a storm. She did not cry out, did not move, only stared toward the barn where the horses tore at their halters. Elias motioned her back, his voice low but firm. "Stay inside." She didn't argue, But she didn't close the door either. He crossed the yard fast, boots sinking in soft earth, rifle raised, eyes sweeping the dark. Another arrow hit, this one grazing across the edge of the roof, sliding down to land at his feet. He caught the flicker of movement on the ridge, shadows against shadows, riders pulling back into the desert night. No charge came, no war cries, only silence broken by the trembling of frightened animals. They hadn't come to kill. Not yet. Elias yanked the arrows from the barn door, the shafts clean and deliberate, left like a mark. He turned them over in his hands, the fletching sharp, the points honed for death if they had wanted it. He set his jaw tight, carrying them back to the porch. Aiyana still stood in the doorway, her face pale in the lantern light. When she saw the arrows, she flinched, shoulders curling inward, as if bracing for a blow. "They found you," Elias said, not as a question, but as a truth laid bare. She lowered her head, dark hair falling to hide her face, and he knew his words were answer enough. He did not press her, only set the arrows down on the table beside the door. The night closed around them again, but the peace was gone, replaced by the knowledge that whoever watched from the ridges was no longer content to wait. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, the shadows restless against the walls. Aiyana sat on the cot with her hands folded tight, staring into the flames without a word. Elias loaded his rifle again and set it across his knees, his eyes never leaving the dark beyond the window. The message had been sent clear as any spoken threat. She was found, and the desert was full of eyes that would not look away. The arrows had changed everything. The quiet that once wrapped the ranch was gone, replaced by the uneasy scrape of cattle hooves and the restless toss of horses at night. Elias found himself rising before dawn and walking the fences with his rifle, eyes scanning the ridges, where shadows lingered longer than they should. Aiyana worked beside him, silent as always, though he noticed the way her shoulders tightened each time a crow flew overhead or the wind carried a sound too sharp. She was waiting for something to come down out of those hills, and he knew sooner or later it would. By the third morning he had made up his mind. He would take her to the fort 2 days' ride south. Whatever danger followed her could not reach beyond the army walls, and though he had no love for soldiers, he believed at least there she would be kept alive. It was the only way to keep his land from being turned into a battleground, and the only way to keep her from drawing more arrows to his door. He did not tell her right away, only saddled his horse in the pale light, his movements slow but certain, each buckle and strap another piece of his resolve. Aiyana came from the cabin carrying a pail, her braid loose over one shoulder, her feet bare in the dust. She saw the horse ready and stopped, her dark eyes narrowing. Elias avoided her gaze, busying himself with the cinch, but when he turned toward the gate, she was already there, standing firm, though her hands shook against her sides. She set the pail down, lifted her chin, and for the first time in her broken English said, clear enough for him to hear, "Not safe there." The words struck him harder than any arrow. He paused, reins in hand, studying her face. She was frightened, yes, but the fear was not of soldiers she had never seen. It was deeper, carved into her like a scar. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, and asked quietly, "Then who is it you're running from?" She held his eyes for a long moment, then shook her head and pressed her lips tight. No answer, but he understood. It was not the army that hunted her. It was her own people. The thought twisted in him, heavier than before. He had seen men abandoned by their kin, cast out for debts or disgrace, but never a girl, never one this young. He searched her face for some trace of lie, but all he saw was the hard truth of someone who had nowhere left to go. His grip loosened on the reins, the weight of his choice pressing down harder than the sun. If he left her at the fort, she would be handed back to the same people who drove her out, or worse, used as a token in games men played with land and blood. Elias exhaled slow, the sound rough in the dry air. He dropped the reins and rested a hand on the saddle horn, staring out at the ridges. "Then I reckon you stay," he said at last. The words pulled from him like water from a deep well. Aiyana's shoulders sagged with something between relief and sorrow, but she stepped aside from the gate and did not look away. Elias turned back toward the cabin, his mind heavy with the knowledge that whatever trouble she carried, he had chosen it now as his own. The fire burned low in the hearth, its glow throwing long shadows across the cabin walls, the kind of shadows that made the place feel smaller, as though the outside world pressed in from every side. Elias sat in his chair with his boots planted wide, his rifle resting against the table within reach, though his eyes were on the flames and not the door. Aiyana sat across from him on the floor, her knees drawn up under the blanket, her face half hidden in the flicker of light. For days she had spoken only in fragments, a name, a warning, a handful of words at most, but tonight he sensed something shifting in her, the way her gaze lingered on the fire, the way her hands twisted the fringe of the blanket, as though working up the courage to let go of silence. He did not push her. He had learned long ago that truth, like a wild horse, would not come if chased. It had to be waited on, coaxed, given the space to walk in on its own. So he poured coffee into his tin cup, took a slow drink, and let the night hold its breath. At last she looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the flames, and her voice came low and uneven. "They call me Ghost." Elias frowned, setting the cup down. She swallowed hard and kept going, her words broken but clear enough. "Sickness came, took many. My mother, my brother, others. I lived." She pressed her hand flat to her chest, as though she could feel that survival burning still inside her. "They say spirit touched me, marked me wrong, not meant to stay. Bad luck, bad blood." Her voice cracked, but she forced it steady again. "They sent me away, alone. Said no tent, no food, no name. Ghost, touched, should walk until gone." She drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her jaw trembling, though her eyes stayed sharp, daring him to look at her with pity. Elias did not. He only leaned back, the weight of her words settling like stone in his chest. He understood exile, understood the cruelty of being cut off from your own, though never in such a way. After a long silence, she went on, softer now, as if confessing something even heavier. "Some want me dead still, to finish, to make sure sickness does not stay. Others want me for trade. Say white men fear ghosts. Say I can be used." Her hands shook as she said it, as though speaking aloud gave shape to dangers she had tried to keep buried. She looked at him then, her eyes wide and unblinking, and for the first time she seemed less like a girl and more like someone who had walked through fire and carried its scars inside. Elias rubbed a hand over his face, staring into the flames. He thought of the riders on the ridge, the arrows in the barn door, the silence that clung to her like a second skin. None of it was accident. She had been driven here by forces that did not rest, and now those forces circled his land. Still, when he met her gaze, he did not see a curse. He saw a survivor. "You're not a ghost," he said quietly, his voice rough with the weight of conviction. "You're flesh and blood same as me." She blinked, a flicker of something unguarded crossing her face, not quite belief, but the faintest recognition of being seen. The fire popped, sending sparks into the chimney, and in that small sound the night felt less heavy. Yet Elias knew the truth of exile was not just behind her. It was still riding the ridges, waiting for its moment to strike. The night carried a restless wind that scraped through the cottonwoods and made the barn doors rattle in their hinges. Elias felt it in his bones before it happened. The kind of weight that settles on a man who has lived long enough to know when trouble is near. He had kept his rifle propped by the door for weeks now, each evening ending with the same habit of scanning the ridges before the dark swallowed them whole. Tonight, when the dogs began to bark and the horses screamed in their stalls, he knew the watchers had finally stepped out of the shadows. The first arrow struck the dirt by the water trough, quivering in the pale light of the lantern that hung from the porch. The second hit the fence post with a sharp crack that sent the cattle bawling in panic. Elias swung the door wide and raised his rifle, his voice low but hard as iron. "Stay inside." Aiyana stood behind him, her small frame tense, clutching the edge of the doorway as though it alone kept her upright. Her eyes were wide, dark pools of fear, but she did not cry out. Shapes moved at the edge of the land, riders slipping through the brush with the speed and silence of wolves. Elias counted more than he cared to, his gut tight but his hands steady. He fired once, the crack rolling across the valley, and a rider tumbled from his horse, the animal bolting into the dark. The others surged forward, answering with a cry that split the night. The yard erupted into chaos, horses rearing in their pens, cattle pressing against the fences, dust rising in choking clouds. Elias fired again, then again, each shot measured, each strike holding back the tide for one more heartbeat. Still, he was only one man, and they were many. He felt the edge of it pressing close, the knowledge that his stand could not last forever. Behind him, glass shattered. He turned in time to see Aiyana hurl the lantern from the porch, her arms trembling with the effort. It smashed against a pile of brush stacked near the barn, flames leaping high and wild, spreading fast in the dry air. Fire roared upward, the sudden blaze throwing a wall of light and heat between the ranch and the riders. Horses screamed and bucked, shadows scattered, and the attackers fell back, unwilling to ride through the inferno. Elias took the chance, firing one last round into the dark before pulling Aiyana back inside. The flames lit the night, their crackle drowning out the sound of retreating hooves. He slammed the door shut, chest heaving, and pressed his back against it. Aiyana stood beside him, her hands shaking, her face streaked with dust and fear. She whispered something in her tongue, low and broken, but he caught enough of it to understand she had not expected to survive this night. When the fire burned lower and silence returned, Elias stepped outside again. The yard was scorched, the air thick with smoke, and in the sand by the trough lay a dark stain that would not wash away. He stared at it a long time, the rifle heavy in his grip. Blood had been spilled, and blood called for more. The riders would be back. The fire had scattered them, but not broken them. They would return, and when they did, it would not be to warn. It would be to finish what they had started. The days that followed the fire carried a heavy stillness, the kind of quiet that comes after blood has been spilled and men no more will follow. Elias woke before dawn each morning and walked the edge of his land, scanning the ridges for riders, listening to the restless shift of cattle and the anxious snorts of the horses. Nothing moved but the wind and the circling hawks, yet he felt the eyes out there, waiting. Inside the cabin, Aiyana no longer lingered under the blanket by the fire. She moved with a steadiness, born not of peace but of knowing danger had found them and would again. Elias put a rifle in her hands on the third morning. It was old, heavier than she was used to, and she struggled at first to lift it steady. He showed her how to rest it against her shoulder, how to line the sights, how to squeeze the trigger slow and even. She missed the first time, the shot kicking too hard, but she did not flinch away. Her jaw tightened, and she reloaded with clumsy fingers until she managed another. The crack split the air, and this time, the tin can on the fence post toppled into the dust. She turned her face toward him, uncertain if she had done enough, but he gave her a single nod. No smile, no praise, only the kind of acknowledgement he himself would have wanted. She nodded back, and that was enough. When he worked the saddles in the barn, she watched closely, her fingers tracing the worn leather, learning how each strap and buckle held weight. Elias showed her how to mend a torn seam with coarse thread, how to oil the leather so it would not crack under sun. She practiced until her small hands moved with the same slow patience as his, and when she finished a stitch neat and strong, she looked at him for a moment, as if waiting for judgment. He ran his thumb along the seam and grunted, "That'll hold." and her shoulders straightened as though the words gave her a place in the world she had not known before. They worked the land side by side, carrying water from the creek, mending the chicken pen, cutting firewood. Elias said little, but Aiyana picked up his silence as if it were another language, answering it with her own. She moved, like someone who had been denied a place too long, someone who had found in the work of her hands proof she could belong. At night, when the fire burned low, he would catch her humming a tune too soft to know the words, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. Something grew between them in those days, unspoken but steady. Not the bond of father and daughter, not the cold distance of strangers either. It was something forged out of exile, the recognition that both of them lived outside the lines others had drawn. Elias had lost his wife, and with her, the life he once thought he was meant to live. Aiyana had been cast out by her own blood, branded as cursed and unwanted. Yet here, on this patch of land pressed between danger and silence, they found themselves building something neither could name. Elias knew the riders would return, and Aiyana knew it too. But in the days between the echoes of violence they worked, they learned, and they endured. And for the first time since she had stumbled half dead by his creek, Aiyana looked less like a ghost and more like someone who was not ready to vanish. The air grew heavier with each passing day, as though the desert itself held its breath. Elias felt it in the way the cattle bunched tight in the pastures, and the horses refused to settle at night. Word had drifted from a passing trader that more riders had been seen along the canyon trails, a band larger than before, armed and moving with purpose. Elias did not need the warning to know it was true. He had lived long enough to sense when a storm was coming, and this one carried not rain but blood. The ranch no longer felt like a home. The fences and barns, once built to keep the world out, now felt like walls closing in, offering no escape if the riders chose to come in numbers too great. Elias walked the yard with his rifle across his back, eyes sweeping the ridges, mind turning over choices that all seemed bitter. He could abandon the place, drive the cattle south, leave the cabin to the flames that would surely follow. He could ride for the fort, put Aiyana in the hands of soldiers, and hope they would not send her back to the people who had marked her cursed. But each thought soured before it finished, and each step he took across the dust only made him feel the truth pressing harder against his chest. There was no safe road, no easy turn. Aiyana moved with quiet purpose, carrying water, feeding the chickens, gathering wood. She asked no questions about the future, only watched him with sharp eyes that seemed to see the battle raging behind his silence. That evening, as the sky turned red over the ridges, Elias sat on the porch, weary from thoughts heavier than work. She came to stand in front of him, her braid falling loose over one shoulder, her small hands clenched at her sides. For a long while she said nothing, only stared past him into the darkening valley. Then her voice came low but steady, a voice different than he had ever heard from her before. "If they call me Ghost," she said, her English broken but firm, "then I will haunt them." Elias looked up at her, the words cutting through his doubt, sharper than any blade. She had been silent for so long, carrying her exile like a wound. But now he heard something else rising in her tone. Defiance, hard and unbending. It was not the cry of a frightened child, but the vow of someone who had been pushed past fear into a place where standing meant more than surviving. He let out a slow breath, the kind a man releases when he knows the choice has already been made for him. "Then we'll stand," he said simply. She gave one short nod, her chin lifted, and for the first time, he believed she was not the broken creature he had found by the creek, but something stronger, forged by the cruelty that tried to erase her. The night settled heavy, the stars sharp above, the land quiet but waiting. Inside the cabin, Elias cleaned his rifle and set cartridges in a neat line across the table. Aiyana sat nearby, running her fingers over the stock of the old rifle he had given her, her lips moving as though repeating words in her tongue, perhaps prayers, perhaps curses. The firelight caught her face, And for the first time since he had known her, she did not look like someone running from death. She looked like someone ready to meet it on her own terms. The storm was gathering, its thunder not in the sky but on the ridges where riders waited. And in that gathering dark, Elias Mercer and Aiyana, two exiles with nothing left to lose but each other, prepared to stand their ground. The first light of dawn came not with peace but with fire. Elias had been awake long before the sun broke the horizon, his body tense, listening to the restless stir of the cattle and the uneven stamping of horses in the barn. The land was too still, the kind of stillness that carries weight before a storm. Then came the sharp cry of a rider on the ridge, followed by the hiss of arrows cutting through the air. One struck the barn wall, another buried itself in the dirt by the porch, and the ranch erupted into chaos. Elias raised his rifle before the echo of the first arrow had faded. Shots cracked through the morning air, each one deliberate, each one buying another breath of time. Dust rose as horses thundered toward the homestead, their riders leaning low, rifles flashing in the half-light. The smell of smoke drifted in as a torch landed near the corral, flames licking dry wood, spreading fast. The cattle bawled and pressed against the fences, their panic drowning out the wind. Aiyana stood in the doorway, a rifle clutched in her hands that seemed too small for the weight of it. Her eyes were wide, but her body did not shake. Elias barked for her to stay back, but she stepped forward, bracing the stock against her shoulder as he had shown her. The first shot kicked hard against her, nearly knocking her back, but the sound of a rider falling from his horse told her she had struck true. She did not smile, did not falter, only reloaded with quick, clumsy hands, and fired again. Smoke rolled across the yard, thick and choking, mixing with the acrid stench of gunpowder. Elias felt the burn in his side before he saw the blood, an arrow grazing deep across his ribs. He staggered but kept his feet, his jaw clenched, his rifle steady. He fired into the press of riders, each squeeze of the trigger a defiance against the numbers closing in. He heard Aiyana's rifle crack beside him, steady and sure, her small frame a stone set firm against the tide. The battle surged and broke against the walls of the cabin. Shouts filled the air, boots pounding, horses screaming, the clash of metal and wood ringing sharp. Elias fought with grim resolve, each movement driven not by hope of victory, but by the refusal to fall while breath remained. Beside him, Aiyana moved like a shadow, darting from the doorway to the window, firing, reloading, her braid whipping across her back. She did not run, did not hide, and in the firelight, her face carried the same hard defiance she had spoken of days before. At last, the riders began to break, pulling back through the smoke, their torches left smoldering in the dirt, their cries fading across the ridge. Elias fired one final shot, the sound rolling long after the dust settled, then lowered his rifle with a hand heavy from blood loss. The yard was scarred, the fences splintered, the barn blackened with smoke, but the homestead still stood. Aiyana stepped to his side, her rifle lowered, her face streaked with soot and sweat. Elias sank to one knee, his breath ragged, but when he looked at her, standing firm, with the weapon still in her grasp, he saw more than a survivor. He saw a fighter, one who had chosen to stand not because she had to, but because she would not be erased. Together they had held the line, and though the ground was stained red, the last rider had fled. The fight left the land quiet, too quiet, as if even the wind was weary from carrying smoke and blood across the valley. The sun climbed higher, showing the damage in full. Fences broken, gates hanging loose, black streaks along the barn walls where fire had licked but not consumed. The ground near the trough was dark with stains that would not wash out, proof of the battle that had nearly ended them both. Elias leaned against the porch rail, his shirt torn and sticky with blood, his face drawn but unbent. Aiyana knelt beside him with a strip of cloth torn from her own dress, her small hands steady as she bound his ribs with quiet care. She did not speak, and he did not need her to. Each knot she tied carried its own kind of language, one that said he was not alone. When she finished, she helped him back into the chair by the door. He sank into it heavy but not defeated, his eyes following her as she gathered tools and set about mending what could be mended. She worked as if the land itself had become her responsibility. She patched the fence with rough hands, shoveled ash from the yard, carried buckets of water from the creek to douse smoldering wood. Elias watched her move, the same girl he had found half dead in the reeds, now walking with the weight of someone who had chosen to stay. Later, as the sun dipped low, she carried a small pouch of corn seed to the creek. She crouched in the soil, dark hair falling loose around her shoulders, and pressed each kernel into the earth with care. Elias stood a little way back, leaning on the rail, the ache in his side sharp but softened by what he saw. She was planting more than food. She was planting herself. For the first time since she had been driven from her people, she was not wandering. She was claiming a place, however scarred, as her own. That night they sat on the porch together, the land stretching wide before them, the sky washed with stars. The cattle had settled, the horses stood quiet, and the smell of smoke lingered faint, but no longer menacing. Elias lit his pipe and drew slow, the ember glowing against the dark. Aiyana sat cross-legged beside him, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes turned upward as if the heavens might finally hold answers. They did not speak of what had been lost, nor of what might come. Words were too small for what bound them now. He did not call her daughter, and she did not call him father. Yet the bond between them was carved deeper than any bloodline, forged in fire, stitched together by survival and choice. Elias had lived long years in solitude, and she had been cast out with nothing but exile to her name. Yet here on this scarred piece of land, they had found something neither expected. When the night breeze stirred the cornfield where her hands had pressed life into soil, Elias looked at her and felt the truth settle in his chest like the last piece of a puzzle. They were a family, not by birth or name, but by the stubborn act of staying when the world told them to leave. And under the wide western sky, that was enough. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.